So we all know that there's this practice of drawing voting districts in like these weird Rorschach test shapes, and we know this is done so that one political party can win more seats in Congress than the other. In the 2024 election alone, just 9% of seats in the US House of Representatives were considered competitive. The rest were very safe, firmly belonging to one party or the other. My question is, why are we just okay with this? Like, how long has this been going on? And are there no alternatives to just letting people sketch out elongated boogers over sections of the state they really like best? Like, what is this? I'm Kevin Lankus, and I'm going to dole out some information about where gerrymandering came from and what we could possibly do to stop it, because nobody likes it. Except for the people who win, but only that, like, one time, because the next time the shapes are going to be different, and it's just so stupid. And now Texas is threatening to redraw districts right now, which is crazy for a bunch of different reasons, and then California Governor Gavin Newsom is responding that he might redraw districts in his state too, but why can we redraw districts at all? It turns out that the practice of gerrymandering dates back to the very beginning of US politics, back to the original colonies of America. And even before that, there was a term in 18th century England to describe the voting districts that resulted from gerrymandering, and they called those rotten districts. The deal was that the political party who was currently doing the redrawing would put as few eligible voters as possible into a district, and that way they would be more easily paid off or intimidated. Then, there weren't as many voters, because don't forget, money and racism. You had to be rich, you had to be white, and you had to be a man to vote. So when voting came over to America, it was much the same thing. And then one particularly egregious attempt to change the party advantage through weird shapes inspired the term gerrymandering that we all know and love today. Come with me now, because the year was 1812, and the Boston Gazette published a cartoon on March 26th reacting to the Massachusetts State Senate, where the Democratic Republican Party, also known as the Jefferson Republicans, had redrawn a voting district to their advantage. The cartoonist, Elkanah Tisdale, had noticed that the district had a striking resemblance to the mythical salamander. So here's the drawing that showed up in the paper, and with the tail and the wings, and I don't think the tongue was any voters, but I guess it could have been. The governor of Massachusetts at the time who signed off on this new district, well, his name was Elbridge Gerry, with a hard G, but over time that G has softened, and now the term we all know is gerrymandering. The gerrymander being this new creature that the state senate had drawn into their voting districts, half Governor Gerry, half salamander. Which kind of sucks for Governor Gerry, because not only do we all pronounce his name wrong, in perpetuity forever, but he also didn't even like what the Democratic Republicans were up to and just was pressured into going along with this new district. And then after that, the gloves were just off. We couldn't put the gerrymander back in the tree stump, the rock basin. Salamanders live in logs, I guess. As a result of their new districts, the Democratic Republicans received 49% of the vote, so not even half. But they came away with 29 out of 40 seats in the state Senate, or an equivalent of 72.5% of the governing body. People were not happy about this result, because back then they paid attention to politics, as opposed to now when this happens by default and, nobody cares. So when the Federalists won control the next year, and they redrew the districts to something a little more reasonable. And after the election in 1813, cartoons popped up everywhere that pictured the gerrymander as a skeleton, implying that the beast had been slain. Problem solved. And that's a claim that in today's parlance, we would say aged like milk, because it just kept getting worse and worse after that. In 1874, South Carolina was the first state to draw a non-contiguous district, or a district that just wasn't contained all in one shape. It did turn out that this was too much for some people in power. They were just like, whoa, hey, now. The House of Representatives told South Carolina it would actually refuse to seat members elected from that district, so the state ultimately had to change it back. It seems important to take the time to note that legislators did have a spine at one point in time. These days, they all pretend their hands are just tied, following high road politics and precedent that doesn't even exist, while other people who feel more brazen about their grifting just walk all over everything. Unfortunately, that didn't stop things back then, because here's what happened in South Carolina. They came back in 1876 with the 7th Congressional District that people affectionately nicknamed the Boa Constrictor District. It was called that because it snaked across the state to loop in as many black families as possible in order to keep them all in just one district. And Mississippi famously did the same thing with their so-called Shoestring District. And this brings us to the single biggest ingredient in the gerrymandering souffle at that time: racism. We know this because we can measure it directly. After the end of the Civil War, when black men won the right to vote, the practice of gerrymandering exploded. Lots of bizarre random shapes, some, quote, long stringy districts, as historians have grossly called them, just popped up all over the place, particularly in southern states, in order to continue to suppress the voting power of black Americans. This was also when states introduced poll taxes and literacy tests and outright intimidation and fraud tactics in order to keep black voters away from the polls. Because just like the tactics used by the English inside the rotten districts of old, collecting people into one place made it a lot easier to control them. It wasn't until the 1960s that the government actually decided that maybe this whole thing was bad. One thing that happened was the Great Migration. Lots of people of color moved into more urban areas, and the voting districts really hadn't changed much for a very long time, especially not enough to account for such a massive population influx. This was a situation that gave outsized power to rural white voting districts. And one thing that we had going for us back then was that the Supreme Court was actually interested in democracy and not just all the super expensive gifts and debt payoffs they could get for ruling a certain way. So the Warren Court made a series of decisions in the 1960s that were collectively known as the Redistricting Revolution. One of those, importantly, decided that disenfranchising black voters was a violation of the 15th Amendment, and they also decided that electoral districts should be drawn based upon uniform population. They also required that districts be redrawn every 10 years after the census to keep voting populations and maintaining the same number of representatives representing the same number of people. None of this fixed the weird-ass shape issue, though. There was another decision in the 90s that tried to do that, but it really ended up not fixing it. And then humans got more and more technologically advanced with all the years that passed, and then so did our gerrymandering schemes. The rules just did not keep up for long because we just used predictive modeling software to rig voting districts for us. In one case, North Carolina's 12th district became known as the I-85 district because it just ran along the highway. And it even narrowed at one point so that it was thinner than the highway itself, so that it could claim to be contiguous when it popped out the other side of the bottleneck. We all know now that the Supreme Court has made kind of a major heel turn lately, and in 2019, they decided that the federal government shouldn't have a say in congressional districts at all, and that the states should just get to resolve their own redistricting issues. Of course, that's crazy because the states have a vested interest in making those districts as stupid as they can so they can ensure the results of elections and determine who wins before anyone even votes at all. Why is everyone fighting about all this? Like, what's the big deal that we can't just figure it out? And why were we just constantly redrawing stupid shapes on the map? What about the actual rules about voting districts? So it turns out that the Constitution says that states should elect representatives, but it doesn't say how. Article 1, Section 4 says that the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. So basically, each state can just do whatever the shit it wants. The very next phrase says that Congress does reserve the right to pass laws to change the process, but it doesn't dictate the process from the start. Now, when we started this whole America thing, the formula for the House of Representatives was one representative for 30,000 residents. As an example of how things worked back then, Pennsylvania got 8 representatives. And PA decided that they would elect them all on a statewide general ticket, so all the voters in the state had a say in electing all 8 of their representatives. Connecticut, New Hampshire, and New Jersey also held their votes in the same way. Some states had a mix of general ticket and district system, so everyone could vote for all the reps, but the reps themselves had to live within a specific district, and that's the one that they'd represent. And then all the rest of the states chose to draw districts and hold votes specifically within those for the representatives who would represent them. And they were all of them immediately thrust into a battlefield that has never let up to this day. Because not even the system had to be consistent, since the Constitution did not specify. So the statewide ticket in Pennsylvania meant that the Federalists were dominating state elections because their strong support in the urban center of Philadelphia just outweighed everybody else. Without districts, population centers controlled voting outcomes. So Western Pennsylvania eventually forced the state to switch to a district system in 1790. But Federalists switched things back to statewide elections in 1792 because they wanted to win some more. And then Pennsylvania went back to districts again in 1794. And this scenario was really common in the early years of the US political system because, again, there were no rules about how to elect representatives, so the party in power just did it however would benefit them the most. States also did the same thing with their electoral college votes, either by allocating them statewide or through congressional districts, whichever would benefit the party in power. So all these rules or systems of etiquette that we think are so sacrosanct and abide by now were just swiftly changed over and over again depending on who was in charge. And now there's only one party that speaks the language of ruthless political opportunism today, and the other one just watches it happen and does nothing. At least part of the chaos was reined in when Congress mandated that all states use the district system in 1842 with the passing of the Apportionment Act. But is there something we could do to fix more of it? What can we actually do to get rid of gerrymandering? The current solutions that are being implemented right now are few and far between. One involves appointing independent commissions to redraw state voting districts, and a few states do this now. It does get us a little closer to proportional representation, but it's also not perfect. And sometimes these commissions can be so politically deadlocked themselves that they don't succeed in drawing a new map at all. And sometimes it fails from the start because party leaders can't even decide who the independent commission should be. Who does everyone trust to redraw the districts fairly? Well, sometimes nobody. A more radical solution that's being discussed but not implemented is just to do what every other democracy in the world does. Wait, are you telling me that Americans just insist on doing things our own way and that way doesn't work? America just insists on playing the game on hard mode? American exceptionalism is really just like unnecessarily enduring, easily fixable hardship? That's crazy talk. That's just crazy talk. You're crazy, man. That's why I like you so much. In 2016, a study of 54 democracies across the globe found that single-member districts like the kind we have in the United States are uniquely susceptible to gerrymandering. It turns out that it's just harder to do everywhere else because they don't make districts with only one representative inside. So one of the easiest ways to fix gerrymandering is to create multi-member districts where voters elect multiple representatives instead of just one. You could create a sort of hybrid system even that isn't a statewide ballot, so population centers don't just run the elections each time, but it's also not just one member per district either. Then it's just a lot harder to draw weird shapes around literally just Bob's house so that he can keep a certain representative in office. Research has found that districts are basically immune to gerrymandering altogether when they reach 5 representatives. We can even see this work in the United States because Illinois used to do it. They had a semi-proportional district system based on population, and only when they switched away from that in the 1980s did it become prone to gerrymandering, and all the competitive voting districts just disappeared. So that one's kind of a no-brainer, but it would also be very difficult to enact this in practice because we'd have to convince all of our representatives to agree to make re-election more challenging for themselves, and I don't think they're going to want to do that. And then there's just totally new systems thought up by researchers, the innovative new processes that could make redistricting a complete non-issue going forward. One of them, a trio from Harvard, Yale, and Boston University came up with, is something called the Define Combine procedure. It's a really simple two-step process that gives both parties a chance to even things out. In step one, one party draws twice as many districts as they need. So if there's 10 districts in the state, they'll draw 20. Then the second party looks at those districts and combines pairs of them together to make the final 10 voting districts. So both parties get a hand in the process and nobody gets to pull one over on anyone. Whatever we do, we should probably do it soon. We're living in an extraordinarily challenging political climate right now, and the deadlocked two-party system of feckless octogenarians who exist solely to take lobbying money and go on vacation 90% of the year just isn't working for anyone. We live in a political stalemate where only corporate power and greed ever breaks through. Fixing America's gerrymandering problem is a great first step to get some momentum going. So as you keep hearing about Governor Abbott and Texas redrawing their voting districts and California doing the same, think about these fixes for the American voting district and make sure you voice your own opinions about these solutions to your elected officials. Let's do some good about partisan politics rigging elections through gerrymandering in America. I'll see you next time, where we vote in the Woodland Conclave or our salamander overlords. Stick with me. Logging off. You get it because salamanders live under logs. Logging off. Oh, yikes. That's just crazy talk. You're crazy, man. You're crazy.